You explain because you think it's the right thing to do, because you've been trained to believe that silence means guilt, that not responding is avoidance, that being unreadable is unfair. So you offer clarity, again and again. You answer questions that weren't asked with curiosity. You provide reasons to people who already made up their mind. You soften your tone, restructure your thoughts, add disclaimers just to keep the connection intact. But here's the part you've always felt but never said out loud. Explaining isn't about being understood, it's about being allowed to stay. Somewhere deep down, you're still negotiating for space in a room that was never built for you. You think if you just find the right words, they'll stop doubting you. But the truth is, they're not listening, they're scanning. And with every word you speak, you're giving them coordinates on how to reach you, how to shape you, how to weaken you. Every explanation is an unintentional confession, and you wonder why you feel smaller after every conversation. You think you're being clear, but what you're actually doing is offering a map to your weaknesses, to your habits, to your breaking points. You explain where you were, why you did it, what you meant, and they listen closely. But not because they care, because they're learning. Every clarification becomes a reference point. Every justification becomes a marker. Eventually, they don't need to ask anymore. They can predict your tone. They can pre-write your replies. They start finishing your sentences because you've trained them how. You didn't mean to, but you handed them the full blueprint. And the worst part? You thought it would help. You thought that being transparent would prove you have nothing to hide, that being understandable would protect you from being misunderstood. But it only made you more accessible. And accessibility kills respect faster than failure ever could. Because the moment they know how you move, they stop treating you like someone they can lose. You don't become trusted, you become calculated. Most people don't ask for clarity because they want to understand you. They ask because they want to reduce you. The more you speak, the more data they have. And the more data they have, the easier it becomes to format you into something they can predict, something they can place in a category, something they can eventually control. They say, just be honest. But what they mean is, make yourself available for manipulation. Because when you speak long enough, you'll say something out of rhythm, something that doesn't fit their expectation, and that's when they strike. They highlight your contradiction. They use your previous words against you. They freeze frame one sentence out of context and pretend it defines your entire identity. And suddenly, the conversation isn't about the subject anymore. It's about your inconsistency. It's not about your message. It's about your tone. It's not about what you meant. It's about how they felt. You become defensive. You try to clarify, and in doing so, you walk further into their framework. You abandon your ground just to fix their misunderstanding. And that's the point. Their misunderstanding was never accidental. It was the opening move. The more you try to correct the record, the more you validate their power to distort it. You're not being heard. You're being handled. You've probably never called it that, but every time you explain yourself, especially when no one asked, you're performing submission. It looks polite, it feels responsible, but underneath that instinct is something older, deeper. Fear. Fear that silence will be misunderstood. Fear that not responding fast enough will cost you connection. Fear that people will walk away if you don't convince them to stay. So you talk, you fill the space, you justify, you clarify, you play defense before there's even an attack. You present your character like a resume, hoping it will shield you from judgment. You preempt conflict by over-delivering context. And in doing so, you rehearse obedience. Not with your posture, but with your language, because language is compliance, it's infrastructure. The moment you start explaining yourself to stay likable, to stay palatable, to stay safe, you've already handed over the most powerful thing you had, your ambiguity. People don't need to know everything about you, and the ones who insist they do are rarely trying to meet you in truth. They're trying to strip away your leverage, and you, by explaining, are assisting them, not out of weakness, but out of programming. The kind of programming that teaches you to be acceptable before you even ask to be seen. You weren't born to be decoded. You were trained to become legible. And now you're tired of being read. They say they want honesty. What they actually want is access. And access is about proximity, emotional, psychological, behavioral. The more they understand your rhythms, the easier it is to set traps. Not physical ones, linguistic ones, relational ones, reputational ones. Because when someone knows how you think, they can begin to frame your reactions, not as responses, but as patterns, predictable, playable, programmable. And that's where clarity becomes dangerous. Not because truth is risky, but because perception is flexible. It doesn't matter what you meant. It matters what they decide you meant. And once you've explained yourself, you've signed the waiver. You've given them permission to misquote, to excerpt, to use your language to shape their version of you. This is not paranoia. It's infrastructure. This is how narrative works, how relationships mutate. One person offers transparency, the other builds a frame around it. And when the frame is strong enough, the truth doesn't matter anymore. You thought that explaining yourself would give you freedom from assumptions. But what it really gave them was raw material, to edit, to bend, to sharpen against you. The more readable you are, the easier it is to write you. And once you can be written, you can be erased. Silence is often mistaken for weakness, for confusion, for retreat. But those who move with intention know silence is a position. It's not about hiding. It's about limiting surface area, reducing points of contact, closing ports that used to leak power. There was a time when you believed that the more you shared, the more you connected. That openness built trust. That availability meant value. But that equation doesn't hold. Not anymore. Because the more you offer, the more they consume, not just your words, but your structure, your internal architecture, your rhythm, your edge. You don't realize how much you've surrendered until you've gone quiet, until you stop filling silence with rescue sentences and soft rewrites, until you stop trying to clarify things for people who were never listening with integrity, until you experience your own mind without their expectations echoing inside it. Friedrich Nietzsche once said, "Silence is worse. It says more." And he was right. Silence doesn't soothe. It signals. It doesn't comfort. It confronts. It makes them wonder what they missed, what you saw, what you're not saying, why you left. And that wondering is the beginning of your return to power. You don't reclaim space by asking for it. You reclaim it by going quiet and letting your absence become undeniable. You don't need to disappear. You need to become inaccessible. There's a difference. One is absence, the other is refusal. You used to think that not responding made you rude, that not explaining made you cold, that silence meant you had something to hide. But you're starting to see it clearly now. The most powerful people are never the loudest. They don't announce boundaries. They don't defend their silence. They let absence work on their behalf. Inaccessibility isn't about vanishing. It's about precision. It's about closing doors that were never respected. It's about removing handles from the parts of yourself that others used to twist. And most importantly, it's about owning your own access. You decide when to open. You decide when to respond. You decide when no answer is the most honest response available. Because the moment you feel obligated to reply, you're already beneath the surface, already pulled into the game, already surrendering your position for the illusion of peace. Unreachability isn't distance. It's clarity in motion. It's the kind of presence that doesn't ask to be noticed, but is always felt. You don't owe your availability to anyone who only values it when it's convenient for them. There's a reason they panic when you go quiet. It's not because they miss your voice. It's because they've lost their grip. They don't fear your absence. They fear your autonomy. When you stop explaining, you remove the feedback loop they've been relying on. They can't measure your mood. They can't mirror your tone. They can't preemptively shape your emotions with the right keyword or apology. They don't know what version of you they're speaking to anymore, and that disturbs them. People who depend on emotional access as a form of influence can't survive your silence, because silence removes their tools. It kills the pacing. It interrupts the script. And in that pause, they begin to feel the absence of control. So they provoke. They accuse you of being passive-aggressive. They say you're overreacting. They demand that you just talk so they can pull you back into the old rhythm. But you're no longer running that script. You're not refusing to speak because you're afraid. You're choosing silence because it's the most direct way to return to clarity. You don't need to defend your decision to go quiet. You don't need to explain why you're unavailable. Silence isn't a lack of communication. It's a different kind of message. It says, I've stopped participating in a system that only functions when I surrender my center. Let them wonder. Let them doubt. Let them misinterpret. You're not being mysterious. You're being precise. You've turned off the signal, not because you have nothing to say, but because you finally know who's worth hearing it. They don't like when you stop responding, not because they miss your presence, but because they miss the feeling of control that came with your compliance. When you used to explain yourself, you gave them entry points. You gave them soft targets. You gave them a rhythm they could follow, manipulate, and eventually weaponize. Your silence now creates an error in their system. They can't decode your intent. They can't manage your emotion. They can't position themselves above or below you because you've stopped placing yourself at all. This isn't social withdrawal. This is psychological reformatting. You are no longer the person who narrates their every move, who translates discomfort into digestible pieces, who clarifies their guilt for them just to maintain harmony. You've left the economy of explanation. You no longer spend your attention trying to calm other people's insecurity. And that makes you dangerous, because when you stop explaining, you stop leaking. And when you stop leaking, you become unpredictable. When you become unpredictable, you become unmanageable. When you become unmanageable, you force the world to recalibrate around you. They can no longer manage your behavior by misinterpreting it. They can no longer provoke a clarification they can twist. They can no longer use your vulnerability as a performance space for their own comfort. Your refusal to explain is not cruelty, it's calibration. You're building new reflexes. You're upgrading the interface. You're cutting out the code they use to edit you in real time. This version of you doesn't speak for approval. It doesn't beg for understanding. It doesn't decorate silence with disclaimers. It simply exists, clean, closed, and uncompromised. You've made the decision to stop explaining, and now the world around you is shifting. People begin to interpret your silence. They invent motives, assign blame, construct entire emotional narratives in the space you've left empty. And that's fine, because their discomfort isn't your responsibility anymore. When you stop narrating your life, people will project their unfinished business onto you. They'll say you've changed, that you're being distant, that you think you're better. But what they're really saying is, I can't read you anymore, and it terrifies me. This isn't you becoming cold. It's you becoming unavailable for distortion. You no longer perform emotional labor for others who refuse to carry their own weight. You no longer set yourself on fire to prove you're warm. You've stopped offering previews of your mind to people who treat your clarity as currency. And yes, people will leave, they'll drift, they'll pull back. Some because they can't connect without overaccess. Some because they only respected the version of you they could interrupt. You're no longer that version. You don't explain your boundaries. You embody them. You don't justify your distance. You anchor in it. You don't provide disclaimers. You provide silence. Because explanation was never the bridge. It was the leash. And the moment you removed it, the ones who depended on it most were exposed for needing you quiet, predictable, available. You are no longer any of those things. You're not speaking less to be difficult. You're not going quiet to provoke. You're simply done performing interpretability. You're not here to be decoded. You're here to be respected or left alone. Let them leave if they must. It's not rejection. It's filtration. Something strange happens when you stop explaining yourself. The people who used to need constant updates from you suddenly fall silent, not because they've respected your shift, but because they no longer know how to approach you without the scripts they relied on. You've become a blank page in a language they were never fluent in. And now they have no idea what to do with the silence you've handed them. Some take your quiet as judgment. Others take it as arrogance. Some try to punish your distance by withdrawing theirs. But what they don't understand is that you're not withdrawing. You're detaching. And detachment isn't passive. It's architectural. It's a redesign of who gets to influence your inner world. You're no longer interested in relationships that only exist through re-explaining yourself. You're no longer maintaining ties with people who need constant translation. You're moving from explanation to observation, from proving your value to witnessing who notices it without your help. This is the part where the right people stay, not because they chase you, but because they never needed to chase to begin with. They were listening even when you weren't broadcasting. They were watching even when you stopped performing. That's the reward for walking away from interpretability. You find those who are fluent in your quiet. you begin to attract people who don't need your clarity to respect your boundaries. People who don't punish your mystery. People who don't need a reason to believe you. And maybe for the first time, you realize something. Your silence wasn't an exit. It was a filter. This is where the game ends. Not with a bang, not with a dramatic exit, but with a quiet refusal to keep explaining your presence. You're no longer giving people a lens. You're no longer handing out emotional templates. You've become the kind of person whose silence is not a pause, but a boundary. And boundaries, real ones, don't need signage. They don't need to be declared. They're felt, and they hold, even when tested. Because now you understand something most people never do. Explanation isn't clarity. It's often the act of begging for comprehension from people who benefit from misunderstanding you. You used to think that if you could just find the perfect words, they would stop hurting you. That if you were clear enough, kind enough, gentle enough, no one would twist your meaning. But the truth is, some people twist you because it serves them to do so. And the more you try to unbend their distortion, the more power you give them. Now you've stopped. Not because you're cold, but because you've evolved. Because survival in a loud world sometimes demands less volume, not more voice. You've replaced the instinct to explain with the discipline to observe. You've replaced availability with intentionality. You've replaced transparency with precision. And people notice. They don't say it out loud, but they feel the shift. They feel the gap they can't cross. They feel your presence even when you're silent, and that unnerves them. That's the final paradox of explanation. When you stop giving it, you finally become undeniable. So let them guess. Let them speculate. Let them feel the discomfort of not knowing. Because the only thing more powerful than being heard is being untouchable. Comment: I am not here to be decoded.